So once again, my question for us this morning is, what kind of shoes are you wearing? What kind of shoes are you wearing? A colleague of mine wrote a sermon about this same text, and what he talked about is that he has a son who has autism. And he said the issue with his son that has autism is that his son is unable to speak. And so when they communicate, it's of course through nonverbal means. And one of the things that his son does every single morning, when his parents come downstairs and they get ready for the day, his son looks at his shoes. Because what his son does is he figures out what kind of day it is by which shoes his parents choose. So if it's a work day, they'll be wearing work shoes. If they come downstairs and they're wearing flip-flops, or if they're wearing slippers, it's a very different kind of day. So Ephesians tells us to choose what kind of shoes we will wear to proclaim the gospel of peace. Now, some of you know that we are finishing up this letter to the Ephesians. These are the last verses of this letter. It was written by the followers of the Apostle Paul back to a church or to many churches in this place called Ephesus. Ephesus is in Asia Minor, and one of the interesting legends about Ephesus is that it was founded by the Amazons. Those women fighters, warriors, supposedly, according to legend, founded the city of Ephesus. Ephesus was known as being in the midst of a violent culture, even from its founding. The word Amazon comes from the root word amazo, which means breast. And so what many people think is that the term Amazon means women who fight like men. So this is the history of this town of Ephesus. From its very beginnings, it was known to be a fighter town, a town of conflict, a town of violence. Even by the time this letter is written, there had been conflicts over and over again. It's on the water, and there would have been vessels used for warfare right on the port. So the people of Ephesus knew about violence. They knew about conflict. Now, at that time, Rome was occupying all of Palestine where Jesus lived, and it too was a culture of violence. It's ironic, of course, that this era was known as the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, but it was only peaceful with other countries. Within Rome itself, it was horribly violent. Anybody that was against the government was put down immediately. The Roman government enslaved people. And so Jesus arrives in this context of violence, of this place that is filled with Roman rulers dressed in their military garb, going about the city, and he comes and dares to share a message of peace. What kind of shoes will you put on? What kind of shoes bring a gospel of peace? Now, this passage from Ephesians hasn't always been used to proclaim a gospel of peace. In fact, in the 12th century, Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a teacher, a preacher in the church, he used these very verses about the armor of God to say that Christians ought to bear arms against anyone who does not believe. He was one of the founders of the Knights of Templar, known for the Crusades, of course. This passage was turned on its head even by leaders of the church to seem to say that we are to be fighters, that we are to put on the armor of God and go against any who disagree with us. But that's not what this passage says. It takes the Roman military garb and assigns new uses for them. So instead of a belt for the military robe, it's a belt of truth. Instead of a breastplate to protect against arrows, it is a breastplate of righteousness. It's a breastplate that's to remind us to do the right thing. The sword is not a sword for violence, but a sword of the Spirit, this portion of Ephesians says. A spirit meant to be the Word of God. And these shoes are meant to be shoes to proclaim the gospel of peace. The church has often gotten it wrong over the years. We've heard and been discouraged and dismayed beyond that. I don't have words to describe what happened in the Catholic Church, but other churches, to say that instead of putting on the armor of God, which should protect the littlest ones, those that are in danger, instead the church over and over again has chosen to ignore the little ones, has not given them the protection that they need, has not used the belt of truth or the breastplate of righteousness. Over and over again, the church has done wrong. And yet, this passage from Ephesians gives us hope that indeed we can be the proclaimers of peace. That the real use of armor is not to defend against our own reputations, but to be protectors of those who need protection. To speak out with the sword of the Spirit for justice, to wear the helmet of salvation, the helmet of liberation for those who are oppressed, to bear the belt of truth and integrity and honesty, and to wear shoes that proclaim peace. So what kind of shoes are you wearing? I don't know about you, but usually when I'm getting ready for the day, my shoes are usually the last piece of clothing that I put on before I go out the door. What kind of shoes will you wear as you go out the door this week? You know, last night I think many of us heard the news rather late about Senator John McCain's death. I spent much of the night reading about McCain, stories of his life. And one of the things that I think was really remarkable, it's how he got his name, his nickname, Maverick, right? Is he very often did the unexpected. Not what his political party or what people would expect him to do. And one story that I found was back in 1993. He and John Kerry, Senator John Kerry, the Democrat of Massachusetts, took a trip to Vietnam. Now, many of you probably know Senator McCain's history, that he was in the Navy, that he was captured, he was in jail at the Hanoi Hilton, the prison in Vietnam, for 5.5 years, where he was tortured. He was placed in solitary confinement for over half of that time. He had an opportunity to be released because his father was a leader, but what he did is he chose to stay as a prisoner until those who had been in prison longer were released first. So back in 1993, 25 years after finally at the end of the war that McCain came home, he and Senator John Kerry go back to Vietnam, and they visit the very prison where John McCain had been tortured and imprisoned for so long. And what's remarkable to me, as we talk about putting on the shoes, proclaiming the gospel of peace, that McCain was often a maverick in that he was willing to meet with John Kerry and together have a conversation about the Vietnam War. Kerry had been in the Navy but then protested the war. They were opposites in many ways. And yet together they made this trip back to Vietnam. Kerry saw the need to wear shoes of peace, wear shoes of conversation, wear shoes that will allow peace to be proclaimed, despite or even because of those who differ from us. My question for us today is, when we get up in the morning, what kind of shoes will we wear? Will we wear the shoes that will go out and fight and confront? Or we will wear shoes that will allow us to listen, to negotiate, and to talk? Thanks be to God for the proclaimers of peace. Amen. I invite you to stand as you're able as we sing number 866.